My name is Jamal Bind. I'm the chair of the Moore Board of Directors, Movement to Omaha for Race Equity. And today we have an interesting presentation and hopefully a great exchange about some of the issues that have happened in Omaha related to police brutality. For some of you who don't know, Moore is a group that deals with anti-racism, probably the only nonprofit in Omaha that has that within its mission statement. And so one of our goals is to oftentimes bring people together, but also to talk about race issues and bring people into the circle to try and reduce the level of racism that's practiced by local institutions, both public and private and so on. Today we have with us is Adam Fletcher. He grew up in North Omaha and primarily the African-American community. He was born in Canada, which is interesting, and he lived in poverty during his youth in North Omaha. Over the years, he developed a blog, web page, and so on, information about North Omaha, and is a prolific writer about things that happen in Omaha, particularly North Omaha. He's written many articles and he's covered many topics in the North Omaha community. Some of us who are homegrown didn't even know that it even existed in some of those things before our time. I read his piece on the late Matthew Staley. Matthew Staley and I was nemesis, both born in Hastings about the same time. Matthew's 3 years older than me, but he passed away a couple of years ago. And Adam wrote a wonderful obituary about him, and I reached out to him at some point to see if we can maybe talk a little bit about that. But today we're going to deal more with the issue of police brutality. One of the local agendas that we're trying to deal with is Matthew talked a great deal about challenging individuals, and he also talked about Uncle Tom's in the city, and he was a very prolific writer also. And Adam had a story to share with me about him and his exchange with Matthew at one point. I learned a great deal about police brutality and the history of police brutality, and I'm all from reading Adam Fletcher's Sasse article that was on his webpage. Also, I would like to add the word murder, because I think there was many of those African Americans who were murdered by the Omaha Police Department, and sometimes people confuse the word with killing and whatever, and they kind of use euphemism and so on. But at the end of the day, in some of those individuals, they were just outright murdered by some of Omaha's finest, and there was really no closure to that. The other thing I want to say is I'm excited that Adam could join us to help us throw down some heavy light, is one of the phrases we use here. And I want to start out by just saying, Adam, share a little bit more with the participants or the viewing audience about yourself.
Thank you, Jamal. I want to say before I start, thank you for having me. I mean, it honors my work and my effort to be in the space with you, and for everybody who's joining us and the folks who will watch us later on. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Over the last, since 2007, I've been researching and writing the history of North Omaha. When I was growing up, over by 24th and Fort, I grew up in a neighborhood that was in decline, right? Everybody talked about the Miller Park neighborhood as having community depression. And what that meant was that it was low income, but also that people just didn't feel well. It had been decades of economic blight, of benign neglect by the city of Omaha, by a decimated school system that was hell-bent on the school to prison pipeline, all of these different avenues for low-income people, for African Americans. And basically the neighborhood was used as an avenue to shuttle people towards the prison. And that's where I grew up. That's how I grew up. I had a chance to make it out. I'm one of my 4 siblings who graduated from high school on time. I'm the first one in my family to ever go to college and graduate from college. And these things matter to me. This is my life that I've lived. Since I've left North Omaha, I have had a chance to get a master's degree in education, have a career in youth development. My work focuses on youth engagement and really what it takes to bring young people into the communities that we need and in ways that we need them to be engaged, whether that's low-income youth, youth of color, youth with under opportunity youth, so to speak. Lots of different avenues that way. But along the way, I decided to engage myself in the place that mattered most to me. And that's North Omaha, and that's its history. First, to start with building history. You know, when I was a kid, we were going up and down 24th Street, we were going up and down 30th, we were going up and down Fort and Ames, and there would be all these old buildings that were like super cool, huge, gigantic Gothic structures or small ramshackle buildings, all kinds of different variety. And we had no idea what those were. It was just like they were ghosts, buildings that were ghosts. Every now and then I'd hear a story from an old person. Mr. and Mrs. Hickerson lived on the corner next door to our house at 27th and Ellison. And Mr. and Mrs. Hickerson taught me about this old Omaha where they grew up back in the dirty 30s and living down by the river and eating dandelion stew and all of that from back in that day. But then she brought me up to current. She's like, in the 60s and 70s, these things happened. We had these commercial districts that were all just empty buildings, and these things happened. And it all sparked my imagination. all these other stories from other old folks. And it all sparked my mind, it all held on. So in 2007, I started researching and writing about it. I found all kinds of articles on Wikipedia about Chicago's history. I was like, well, if they can do that for Chicago, I can do that for Omaha. So between 2007 and 2012, I started just over 300 articles related to the history of Omaha, Nebraska on Wikipedia. So basically, anything that you see about Omaha, I probably started that article. And that was a long time ago. In 2012, I started NorthOmahaHistory.com. And since then, I've researched and written just about 550 articles. I published 3, 4, 5 books now, all related to North Omaha's history in various ways. North Omaha History Volumes 1, 2, and 3 are about 900 pages, all collected on the neighborhood's history. Omaha Black History is all about African-American people, places, and events in Omaha's history. So I got all these angles on Jamal, but along the way, I've had all these conversations. I've been talking with folks, and one of the folks, of course, was Matthew Stelly, who came at me with some large story about how I'm a white guy who should shut up about African-American history. And I agreed with him. And I had to keep going because nobody was telling the story. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, and things have changed in the last couple of years. But I still push, and I'm still trying to get it out there. I love the work of the Great Plains Black History Museum. Much props and respect to what they've tried, especially in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And to all the different folks who are doing African-American history in Omaha, as well as North Omaha's history, that are rising, that are coming. I want to help you. I want to support you however possible. So I always invite and welcome people to come in. But basically, that brings us up to present. And the reality is the topics have to get deeper. So I have been digging in. I wrote an article on the history of mob terrorism in Omaha. I wrote an article on the history of bombings in Omaha, more than 100 bombings in Omaha's history, not just from the 70s, not just in North Omaha, but going all the way back to the 1860s. I mean, Omaha's been nuts with this stuff.
So let me interrupt because I want to get to some of these questions when we get to the audience. Go back to your Matthew Stelly's so on. Why? Yeah. How did that conflict happen? Because Matthew was known for prolific writing. I know when he passed, he left his archives to someone. I heard it may not have been passed into the general public or whatever. But give me a little bit more on that, and then I'm gonna switch up to some other questions I'm gonna get to if we can.
I would suggest that anybody who's interested in learning about Matthew Stelly, check out that biography that I wrote. But I've got a link to his books on Amazon. And he's got a dozen books on Amazon that go into political, social, cultural analysis of the history of Omaha. Matthew and I wrote 2 different ways. I wrote about North Omaha's history in the sense of geography, everything east of 72nd over to the river, everything north of Dodge Street up to Washington County line. I include all of that in North Omaha. When Matthew talked about North Omaha, he was talking about African-American history. He was using it as a synonym for Black history in Omaha. I didn't argue that. I still don't argue that. My point is the story is big and I want to get the whole story as well as African-American history, everybody's history. Matthew didn't like that. He thought that was a white guy's opinion and that white guys need to shut up about African-American history. So he reached out to me to tell me to shut up. And when he didn't like that, my response to that, he offered me an opportunity to solicit a review of my books from him because he thought that would lend me credibility. When I turned down that solicitation, I don't have the money for that. I'm not a rich man by any measure. He actually threatened my life and suggested that when next time that I came to Omaha, I need to get ready to die. And so, it was that kind of thing that tampered it down. So when he passed, I looked around the internet and couldn't find anything about him. I didn't find any internet presence for him. So that's why I wrote that obituary, to try to get a truth out there. Now, how accurate it is, what I missed, I'll grant that I'm still a white guy who's just trying to do some history, but I tried when nobody else has tried. And there's still nothing else about it.
And one of the reasons I raised the issues, I knew about him after I came back from Africa, but I just was disappointed when he passed. There was not a lot of fanfare, in particular for Black studies, where he taught for many years, and he was some of the old guard or old school who should at least acknowledge. And there's an African proverb we say in Botswana: when the lion dies, we talk about the lion's skin. So you don't say certain things people around, but at least you say the good things about their skin. I want to switch up a little bit again. Many people question the role of the Douglas County Historical Society. Some have said to me it doesn't contain a lot on African American culture. Even the Nebraska Historical History Group has some archives and some issues I've read over the years from that. Do you get any of your information from those 2 sources when you write? How do you get the particular nuance of African Americans or North Omaha? Are they a big help to you in your writing?
So honestly, neither of those organizations are of big use. Particularly in African American history in Omaha. And they will both say as much in closed audience, as it were. That said, I know that they're making efforts. Both groups, both organizations are making efforts to try to move it to the forward of their agenda. But the Nebraska State Historical Society, which is called History Nebraska now, if you want to Google them, the fact of the matter is they have so many agendas, and much like it seems to me, much like all African American issues in Nebraska, it's just another one way down a line instead of having any focus or emphasis, even with the current awareness across the entire nation of the role of African Americans and how the United States owes Black people a debt of gratitude for preserving and building democracy when nobody else does. The Nebraska State Historical Society doesn't feel that urgency. The Douglas County Historical Society is trying. They actually did some features in February focused on Black history. However, it's still that compartmentalization and tokenism and isn't put in the forefront of their organization and never has been. They do have archives at both organizations that are relevant to Black history, but we need some real historians to get in there and do the work of pulling that out and figuring out what that is, and then cross-hatching that against what the Great Plains Black History Museum has and what Bertha collected and what her predecessors or successors have collected, as well as the Durham. Now, the Durham Museum, they sit on a photo archive of millions of photos. And what I know is that only a handful of them, a teeny tiny portion of them, a couple 100,000 out of literally 1 million photos or more, have been actually released onto their online archive. We need the Durham to focus on African American history and to get Blacks in photographs into the public viewing, into Omaha space, so we can share that. So I have love for what they've done so far. They can do so much more, just like all history organizations, but especially in Omaha.
I want to switch right into your series that you did on police brutality. And one of the things I also shared with Leo Lewis, your particular information, his comment was there was not all the names that he knew of. Obviously, you only listed 33, and obviously you had many more killings and murders by Omaha Police Department back in the day and so on. And my question is, how do you decide who to include and not in your 33 pieces that you pick in describing these brutal atrocities by Omaha finest?
Yeah. So Jamal, I basically have 4 sources that I drew from to collect these particular biographies. The Omaha World Herald's archives and its predecessor, the Omaha Herald and the Omaha World, that are all online and that are searchable. The Omaha Star archives, going back to 1939 when they were founded, that's available through the Omaha Public Library. The Omaha Monitor, which was started by Reverend John Albert Lewis in the 19-teens, and that went on for a couple 20 years. And the Omaha Guide. The Omaha Guide's newspaper and the Omaha Monitor are both on the Library of Congress website, the entire collection of newspapers. So then they're searchable that way. So I had to go through, and I spent literally 100 hours researching the whole article in these 33 examples. It is completely incomplete. And I invite people at the end of the article and throughout the article to contribute, share more names, more things that I should find out about. But basically, Jamal, it's the ones that I could cross reference and make sure that if one source said it did or didn't happen, then the other one agreed with that. So that's difficult with the Omaha World Herald. I can't use that as my main source of information about Black history in Omaha because it sucks, because it was patently racist for more than a century. And that said, if they mention police brutality, I cross-reference that against the Omaha Star or the Guide or the Monitor, which were all African-American led newspapers intended for the Black community in Omaha. And I cross-reference it against those. So I have the disadvantage of not being in the community, being able to go to human beings and say, hey, what do you know about police brutality? Give me some names, places, events, and times. But I do have the advantage of all of that time spent online in those references, sources and whatnot. The other places that I drew from were actually Matthew's books as well. He's mentioned a few, and so I brought those out and used those, and I also brought out a couple. You'll notice in the article, though, Jamal, I don't mention my sources, and I don't reference links. I don't put in citations, because I'm not trying to be an academic who's studying this. I'm trying to be a human who's living it, and really interfacing with it. And frankly, I don't want to provide sources for academics who need to do work better than I could do anyway. So
yeah. The other thing is, when I was reading the series and reading the number of incidents and people, question came to mind: said any of those family members of so-called Afrocentric academies or UNO, Creighton, whoever does that, have any of them come and talk to you about this particular series? Because I found it somewhat powerful in the sense that we haven't explored this in kind of a community setting, particularly from a healing, reconciliation, and even holding a racist police department accountable. So has there been any contact by any of those victims in those series, or families talk to you about that? This is all online, Adam?
Yeah. Jamal, it's an awkward thing because frankly, sometimes I'm just barking into the wind, right? I'm yelling into a vacuum cleaner in the sense that I have 7,000 followers on the Facebook page for North Omaha History, and I can put it out there and get 20 responses. You know how
Wow.
Facebook throttles content, right? And so, and I track my statistics and everything for reading the articles and who's reading what and whatnot. And it's disheartening to me to admit to you that my article on the history of Hummel Park is 20 times more popular on this history of police brutality in Omaha.
Wow.
But the fact of the matter is, I'm using one to try to get people into the other. I'm using white history to try to get them to get white people to pay attention to black history, and on and on. So no, it's under reference. People have not reached out to me, and there's so much more room for this conversation to grow in substantial and deep ways.
One things that come to mind, particularly as someone who writes as profusely as you do, or at least lay out some of this information that can at least whet the appetite of some local yokels in a sense. And I'm concerned about the marriage of the judicial and criminal justice departments at UNO, Creighton, and the lack of them to produce anti-racism or deal with African Americans culture and so on. From your vantage point, how do we deal with these historical traumas or the things that you read or wrote about to help bring closure? Because I see people who are still afraid of police officers. They don't trust them. You hear the police lying all the time. They got one of the best forces in the world, but I've heard from some police officers that they really don't solve some crimes. They got a lot of cold cases. The demographics is a joke, and so on and so on and so on. So my point back to you is, how do we, from your vantage point, and obviously you're not living in Omaha today, but how do you get to closure to some things that you wrote about or you saw?
So, Jamal, I'm of the belief that white people need to confront white supremacy. We have done a terrible, to say injustice isn't the right word. The fact of the matter is, though, is that this oppression of African Americans has benefited us in countless ways. My work, what I do in this status with NorthOmahaHistory.com is volunteer literally hundreds of hours every month to researching and writing and promoting all of these different topics with the idea of raising consciousness, of raising morality, and frankly, confronting my white brothers and sisters in our apathy and intransigence towards the oppression of African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and everybody around the world. The fact of the matter is, but at the end of the day, white people have got to do more. I can't say what African Americans need to do. That's not my role. But what I will say is that I am putting the content out there. I published a book on Amazon. So if people want that legit, what is Black history in Omaha? Just hashtag Omaha Black History. It's written as a chronological timeline. It includes good, bad, happy, sad, the whole 9 yards, people, places, and events all throughout the city. But I also have, again, 550 free articles on the web right now. So it's like, let's all share this information. Let's all get it out there and let's do more to build it. I have had people in the community. A man named Calvin Williams runs an organization called Freedomtainment that really puts together for the last couple of years the Juneteenth celebration at the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation. And Calvin has supported me and reached out to me to help build their community and the history within the Juneteenth celebration. I wrote an article on the history of Juneteenth in Omaha that actually goes back to 1871 as the first Emancipation Day celebration in Omaha. So all of those years, 150 years, with the NAACP at the front of it for several years, the Omaha NAACP at the front of it for several years. And I shared that history with Omaha NAACP for the first time, and they didn't have it just 3 years ago. And so, it's these kinds of things. We've got to get this history out there. Bethel AME, Old Line Church has been on 24th Street for 100 years. Bethel AME found the history that I wrote about their church, and that's what they use for their church history now. So we've got to surface Black history in Omaha wherever it shows, good, bad, happy, sad, the whole 9 yards. And I think we can all do that no matter what our color is, whether we're white or African American or identify in any of these ways. But we've got to do more progressive things more actively. And like you said, confront this reality that white supremacy has dominated history, but it dominates Omaha, and Omaha exists for the benefit of white people. So how do we flip that script, really switch the conversation? It's by taking control of the communication and pushing it out in a different way. And that's really what my goal is.
Well, during my lifetime, I'm switching particularly to the brutality of the police officers, and we kind of focus a little bit more here on that. Richard Kellum was one that came to mind, and again, he was killed, I think, an altercation happened about 1986, I'm thinking, according to your document.
That's right.
And
Yep.
the other thing about him, he was like a 98-pound weakling, kind of a very small built man. And he got into an altercation with his niece, I heard. And then they came and I guess some kind of the police got involved. They arrested the guy, took him downtown and beat him to death in police custody. And again, that led to Senator Chambers basically bringing that grand jury kind of legislation in. Again, they're making a farce of it today by having 20 cases at one grand jury, which is a joke. But my point is, Richard Kellum, as far as I know, there was never justice for him. They show a picture of him on the news media where he had the tubes all hooked up to him before he died. And I heard that I heard from Tariq that Brenda Smith, one of the local promoted Black deputy police chief, was on guard, or at least in charge of the jails. Again, I'm only going by what was told to me, but I do know we have Black folks or dark-skinned folks in the police department who are not worth their salt in dealing with this. But my question back to you, going to the Richard Kellum things, was there anything in that case or anything that you knew that, egregious as it was, that we should be about getting justice, as in the case of the Emmett Till case that came up recently? The Richard Kellum.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, no matter how we look at it, Jamal, Omaha's police department has a more than century-long pattern of targeting African Americans with violence, with brutality, with murder in order to suppress the community. Omaha will not pay attention to that. It's the fact of the matter. However, we can have decisive, incisive, and deep conversations within the community that raises the community's consciousness in order to get attention into cases like Richard's. And that's what you're doing here. We need more of these conversations. So with Kellum specifically, the fact of the matter is the Omaha Police Department controlled the narrative from the arrest all the way through the death of Richard Kellum, all the way through his murder. Even though the NAACP at the time tried to raise the alarm, tried to get a shout out, tried to get things to happen, the fact of the matter is 150 different allegations of police brutality by the Omaha Police Department were brought to the Justice Department, to the U.S. Justice Department, and they did nothing.
Wow.
So in '86, that was the era of Reagan. So we got to remember that that Justice Department was as corrupt as anything that we've seen in the last several years. But that said, we can still work with that. We can see that as a starting point. We can take this history and other histories that exist to show that pattern of behavior, contextualize Richard Kellum into that larger pattern, and then show that to today's Justice Department. We could show that to today's elected officials. We could show that to people who are responsive to us as voters and us as community members, and demand accountability. And that's the difference between today and 1986, when Richard Kellum got murdered by the police. The fact of the matter is, they have to be accountable to us, even if it's tokenistic, even if it's for show. It's more than we ever saw before.
Right.
So we got to step forward in at least this new way.
You know, as you mentioned, it becomes a memory. There was a guy who was at the 30th and Lake Street who apparently, I don't know if he was speeding or whatever, but anyway, about 4 or 5 police officers got up and beat the snot out of him. And he was physically had to go to the hospital. And the guy who was a 7-Eleven clerk saw the whole thing and said he was willing to testify. The way I got involved is his mother knew me through the St. Martin de Porres, so she asked me to write the narrative up of what happened to him. But I don't know what came out of that incident. But I do know that he was physically, I can see he was physically beaten when he came to my office by Omaha Police Department. And this before we had the public safety auditor. And then when we got the auditor in, her hands was tied. They got rid of her in a sense, and then they never brought her back. And one of the excuses the Lion Wonders used it, they didn't have the budget or they didn't have the money. And what happened is the police department in Omaha, with their retired police force, union, and so on, are so powerful that they control the narrative that you never got that auditor back. And again, you can't have the police department with all the corruption and stuff that goes on in Omaha. You know, they got sexual harassment charges brought against them. They say, you know, they put one dark-skinned person up and say there's no sexual harassment in the paper. How can you say that when every time you look up every 6 months, there's some incident involving a police officer doing some dysfunctional stuff? So one of the things we got to do as a better job is come back and bring closure and get rid of this narrative of this lie that we got one of the finest forces in this country. In actual fact, it's a self-serving. And again, the documents that you provide illustrates that very well. Switch up on you a little bit more. I remember reading about the Fred Hampton case in Chicago. They ended up paying him, millions of dollars, about $1 million to his family. Did we have anything like that at Omaha where somebody paid somebody off?
I haven't found any cases where the Omaha Police Department has been held accountable in any measure for their brutality against different folks. I mean, Octavius Johnson, this is just in 2013. Octavius Johnson was filmed. It was blown up on YouTube. It was a huge incident where it was blatant police brutality in response to a ridiculous stimulus. I mean, the fact of the matter is Octavius and his brothers were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong cops chasing them. And when these cops descended on Octavius and his brothers, they issued the beatdown. They went to the house and beat up his moms. I mean, all kinds of things. Now, that case got quiet. I don't know what happened. I can't find it in the media. I didn't find it on social media. And so there are things like that. We have cases like what happened to George Bivens. We don't know what happened except for a police officer that got a disability pension, and the cop who was involved in the case, who shot Bivens, he took disability and he bailed out of the police department. And so like things like that have happened, but we don't have a direct payoff. We don't have an incident where it looks as if the police department has simply tried to hush people or otherwise suppress conversations. These conversations just stop. And so that's one of the confusing things to me. And there are lots of loose ends. I mean, if you read over this article, you'll find lots of loose ends. A young Native American man in 2007, his case was rolling. It was loud and then just stopped. A young Hispanic man in 2012, 12 years old. His case went to the FBI and the FBI got involved and then just stopped. The Johnson brothers, Jasmine McMiller in 2014, she got a $40,000 settlement. So that gets close to what you're mentioning, but then everything just stops. So there are payoffs, there are different things that are happening, but I don't know the impetus for why they're happening. And frankly, I can't tell that whole story, and I don't claim to. The fact of the matter is, I am simply bringing it up and trying to raise the conversation. We need academics, we need scholars, we need people who can really get into the police department, who can interview the people who are still alive. We need them to elaborate on all of these and really bring out the rest of the story, because I think that's what we need, at least, Jamal, and I think that's what you're asking about. What is the rest of the story here? If we can go back historically as well as currently, that'd be great.
You know, we're getting ready to open up to the audience, but one thing I will say, this police department is spending an inordinate amount of money on spokespersons when they should be spending money on community engagement. I'm not aware of the police chief or even the previous ones having a community forums where they did it by themselves. I used to attend their 360 meetings, and you know, I would ask a question. Usually I was one who always had a decent question. The rest of the folks would sit there like sheep and let them make their Easter piece and nothing would come out of it. But what was unfortunate to me, the questions I asked, they never resolved the issue, and they always say they'll get back to me. In one of the last ones I participated, they flew some overhead flyers out, but nothing came out of it. But I really think we got to do a much better job of having town hall meetings in the community and letting the chief and the deputy chiefs and all those inklings and individuals stand up in public and engage in community, because we really don't have that from the mayor's office, county commissioners, they all school board, they all sit there and so on. So we're at about almost halfway to our point in this program. And what we normally do at this point is we allow the audience or the participants to raise direct questions to Adam of his series or whatever. The other thing is the article is on our webpage. You can read it there. They also have some links where you can find some of the other documents that he alluded to. So there's an opportunity to catch up with him afterwards, but I want to make it clear to folks, we only have about 30 minutes, so I want us to kind of be brief with our questions or comment and see if we can get as many people as we want. So if you could unmute yourself if you're ready to ask a question, or if you want to put it in the chat, we can do that. But what we try to do is get as many people as possible to engage the presenter or the speaker on the topic of the day. And so again, it's not about politicking and posturing as much as it's about trying to deconstruct some of the conversations that we're having related to police brutality and elsewhere. So anyone wants to raise something at this point, feel free to. And we have people on Facebook as well as we have people on our Zoom here at Moore. Is there any hands up? Anyone? This is a quiet group today, huh? This is a controversial topic. I even saw one of the guys running for office signed up, who's running for county sheriff office, one of the police department folks had signed up. So yeah, unless you're working for the FBI, they say. And by the way, that's another point. I had a chance to visit the FBI building probably about 3 months ago. That was the first time in my lifetime I've been in the building, but it reminds me of something in South Africa, Fort Knox. I saw one black man in the whole building, but I was only for like maybe an hour. But it was unfortunate that, again, they don't have a track record of engaging our community except when they want to give people federal time in collaboration with the police department. But other feedback, I see, there's somebody raised a point here. Does Omaha have a current active police auditor or watchdog organization?
I'll just respond to that really quick by saying no. There is an internal group within the police department, but it's not made public what their role is anymore. That was mandated by the Nebraska State Legislature, and Ernie Chambers was responsible for getting that in place. And there have been different times throughout history when that group has been more or less active, but it basically started in 1981, and it should be going to some effect today. Actually, I have a letter to the editor from 1981 where they said policemen who obey the law have nothing to fear from any effective alert police watchdog group. Only those officers who have no respect for the law will pay a penalty. Reward the good, punish the guilty. That was in 81 from the Omaha World Herald editorial section. We still need that group today, but we need more accountability. It's funny to me, and not funny, but it's sad to me in this time of internet transparency, quote unquote, that we don't see more from it. We need a more obvious, more transparent, more accountable group within the police department and beyond the police department calling for that accountability. But we don't know what that is right now, Katie, and we should.
As you mentioned, that there was a numbered period of years, and I heard recently the Omaha Police Department doesn't report some of the data to the FBI and some of the issues dealing with rape. And then also I know there's some crime statistics that they're supposed to report, they have not. So sometimes we hear news from the police department is fictitious news or made up news because it's not collaborated or reported to national sources to validate against other similar situations, so on. There's another question. If you want to, you can also unmute your mic and ask directly of Adam if you want to.
So the next question. Sorry, I was just going to read this next question. You want to do it?
Go ahead.
The question says, what endeavors exist to address the need for oversight and accountability and victim support through policy development? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, the fact of the matter is, again, that transparency and accountability, what the police department is doing today, is virtually nil. I am a primarily internet-based researcher, so I've looked over the entirety of the Omaha Police Department website. I've looked over the city of Omaha's websites. I've looked through the minutes for the city council, and these are not evident that any of these activities are happening aside from alluding to them. So we don't have direct accountability. We don't know exactly what's going on.
Okay, was your voice being raised? Was you say something? You want to say something?
That was me.
Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead.
There is a mayor's oversight committee that reviews citizens' complaints after they're investigated by the Internal Affairs Department. So there is it's toothless, and the first mayor appointed to all resigned because they gave them no authority. They couldn't really ask questions. They had nothing. So it's there, but I would fully agree it's more a mouthpiece, just a feel-good thing that has absolutely no authority to make any changes or relevant changes.
Thank you. There's another one for Paul. He says, within a few years after the Mike Brown event in Ferguson, I was told that St. Louis was statistically the worst city in the U.S. for police brutality, and Omaha was second. Are there public statistics on this, and that would support this assertion?
So one of the things that I did, Paul, was scan the entirety. I went through ProQuest. I went through a couple of different academic databases to make sure that I wasn't missing any data source that anybody had already done. I haven't found the data that back that up, but I am definitely looking for it. So if anybody else comes across it, please share it. Let's get some numbers into this article and really talk about those statistics.
There's another one.
Oh yeah, there's another one there from Vaughn.
Okay, go ahead.
Vaughn says, what happened to Richard Henry and a number of the other Black folk appears to be suspicious as well as systemic. So Vaughn, I researched that, and you'll see that his name is actually now in the article in a short summary of what happened. That's number 15 in the article. 1967, Richard Henry was a young man who was taken into police custody. And the long story short is he, quote, committed suicide. in police holding. Nobody was ever held accountable. There was never any outcome for what happened to him while in custody. And the fact of the matter is, after him, 3 other young people died in police custody as well. There was a little bit of a upraising around it, but all of that was superseded by the murder of Vivian Strong, which came in 1969. So this pattern of the police department murdering young people was never resolved. It was never dealt with, and nobody ever looked into Richard Henry's death in any substantive way, as far as I can tell, Vaughn.
Well,
but thanks for your question.
Part of that also alludes to the judges as well as the county attorney. And again, you've seen cases where there was marijuana planted on by one police officer on the victim, and then they end up throwing that out. But you got these guys all in the same bed. They sleep in the same bar. I mean, they hang out in the same social settings, and you wonder why we have disproportionate of people in there. There's another question here: have there ever been any police arrested or held accountable for wrongful deaths or so on, or in these scenarios that you talk about, Adam?
So that's a wide chasm between arrested and held accountable. So there have been arrests of police before. I mean, 1969, Vivian Strong, a police officer whose last name was Loader, murdered a 14-year-old girl who was playing in the projects. Her and her friend found an empty unit in the Logan Fontenelle housing projects, and they were playing a record player and having a dance party, hanging out. There was like 3 or 4 of them. They were all teenage girls. A cop comes in, yells something. One cop goes around the front, the other one comes through the alley. The girls spill out into the alley and go to run. This white cop, Loader was his last name, shot this young girl, this 14-year-old girl, in the back as she was running away. He was placed on immediate leave and then taken to trial and found not guilty. So there's a difference between being arrested or being placed on leave and being found guilty. So far as I could tell, there have been several police who've been placed on leave. It's happened repeatedly throughout time, from the 60s all the way through to present, so 50 years and more. But the fact of the matter is, so few of them have ever faced any consequence. In the 2000s, there have been some incidences of police being fired, and I detail those inside my article, so you can find out more information there.
Yeah. Other feedback, other reactions. Shireen raised a point. Do you think it's possible for facilitated dialogue between police officers and community members to have a positive impact on reducing the level of police brutality?
It's a tricky question because the fact of the matter is they've been happening. These kinds of dialogues have happened since the 1960s in Omaha. During the rioting era between 1966 and 69, and that's when the major riot events happened on North 24th Street and North 16th Street. The mayors took it upon themselves to have these kinds of dialogues, and they happened like a dozen times. But the fact of the matter is, no teeth. I mean, if we're going to use that analogy, this happened repeatedly. And the reality is the phrase positive impact is kind of loaded itself, right? Because it could mean so many different things. But if we're talking about a positive impact for African-American people, it's not evident that it's ever created any substantive change to have these kinds of dialogues. I think what we need to move beyond dialogue is towards accountability. Because it's one thing to be able to talk into a vacuum. It's another thing to be able to have an exchange that leads to an outcome. So if we're going to hold African Americans more accountable than anybody else in the city, than white people in the city, then we need to have more accountability by African Americans of the police. If low-income people are going to be held more accountable, then low-income people need to hold police more accountable, and on and on. Any of these disparities, we need to flip these scripts and turn them into power propositions instead of oppressions in order to actually have positive impact. So instead of just another dialogue, let's have some teeth and really talk about what substantive change and accountability can come because of it.
Also, you have your hand up. Got a question? Unmute your mic.
Right. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, I don't know if your research has led you to this, but you were discussing a lot of individuals, police officers who were basically let off the hook for a lot of the things that they've done in terms of murders, in terms of things of that nature. Is there any sort of research into the court documents to see what evidence presented, what the jury looked like, what evidence was excluded, just to kind of see if there's some sort of pattern throughout the years of why these white officers who are committing some of these egregious crimes are being let off the hook? So I don't know if that's been able to look at, but I think that would be something that's very interesting for
I think that's a great research point. That's a great question in general. And the fact of the matter is, for me, I don't have access to those documents, and I would love to see academic scholars, people who actually know what they're doing, to get into those files in order to find them. I see a master's degree out of that. I see some dissertations, but the possibilities are there. We just need that level of coordination among the different advocates and activists in Omaha to make sure that we're asking the right questions and doing the deep research. And then B, we need dissemination, because it's one thing to write these reports, it's another thing to get them out to the public. Jamal and I were talking about this beforehand. I've written this article several months ago, about 5 or 6 months ago, and it's great to see people have interest in it. Jamal, thank you again for highlighting it and really bringing it out. But the fact of the matter is, so very few people have seen it. So very little of Omaha, and I'm on the internet blasting this thing like a trumpeter. I mean, and I don't have a lot of skill, but I know how to get people's attention sometimes. But it didn't work with this article. It didn't work with this topic. So we need sophisticated, complicated, complex, and deep study like you're talking about to really shine that light, because the superficial study hasn't really shown it as well as it could. You could show it a lot better. Whoever else picks this up can show it a lot better by getting into those deeper statistics and the fact of the matter. So thank you for raising that. Let's do that.
And I would say one other thing, years ago, I found out that people go to law school in Nebraska, both UNL Law School as well as Creighton, they do not have to take any course related to race or poverty. So basically when they graduate, they learn on the job. And again, I've interacted with lawyers, and some of them were dumb as rocks when it comes to cultural issues or interacting with people of color and even issues of poverty. And so you would think with all the scholars and academicians who write articles and law reviews, somebody would have gone back and look at all the negativities and the stuff that happens with the court systems dealing with African Americans in terms of sentencing laws. And again, you see it on the national level, but we got a smorgasbord of examples of malfeasance locally, corrupt cops, corrupt lawyers, corrupt, things that happen, and you don't see the research out there locally. How do you clean it up? So it's almost like Omaha becomes like a little company town. And again, people are afraid to challenge these wrongdoings. And then on the national level, you see some of these these lawyers getting $6 and $7 million. Whereas in Omaha, Robert Wagner got $100,000, and that was petty cash compared to how bad they beat him up. But again, they should have given him at least $1 million. The whooping that he took that day from some of Omaha's finest. And so again, that's part of the conversation we need to have, because again, if you don't deal with this trauma, it permeates into the whole community. And then we have people who are afraid to call the police officers or even interact with them, because again, we see them as thugs with uniforms on. Again, I'm not gonna say all of them are like that, but they oftentimes don't point out the ones who are doing the harm. And they have that thin blue line that we see so well in the media as well as locally here in Omaha.
So there is
go ahead.
Just to say really quick, there is a professor at Creighton. Her name is Palma Joy Strand. And Professor Strand wrote an article for a law review about redlining, the history of redlining in Omaha. And she brought it to me because she had found my article online. I wrote an article about redlining in Omaha a decade ago. However, unpopular topic, especially 10 years ago, nobody was talking about redlining in Omaha. It just was not a conversation. So Palma Joy Strand picks up that article and she elaborates on it. She wrote a beautiful, sophisticated analysis, and she really got into it. She actually went to DC, found the original redlining map by the Homeowner Loan Corporation from Omaha from 1936, and really just brought that officiality to it. So we do have some people in the city, in these academic institutions, who have tried. That was just 5 years ago, I think, that her article was published, but all the same, she tried, she brought it out. We do have some dissertations, we do have some theses that have been written that are available on the UNO website, buried down inside their archives, that are available on the UNO website, buried down in their archives. So we can do a better job of surfacing those. Actually, on NorthOmahaHistory.com, I have a listing of some different academic sources that people can draw from, but the depth and the breadth of that analysis is weak at best. So we might have one article on redlining when we need 20. We might have one article on police brutality. We might have one article on any of these given issues, of prison school pipeline and so forth and so on. But the fact of the matter is we need much, much more. There's a great question.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yes.
This is Tim Ashford. How you doing there, Jamal?
Fine. How you doing, Tim?
Fine. I have a number of issues, too many to be discussed here. For your information, I've sued the state of Nebraska and a lot of the judges for racial discrimination. That's my background. they appointed Black attorneys as a result of my racial discrimination lawsuits to be court appointed. But the issue I have for you, and the sole issue, is Nebraska Revised Statute 29-1401. That's when the grand jury is called. You talked about the Bibbins case. I was assistant special prosecutor on that case. And if you want to do some research on this, Ernie Chambers had the law whereby if anybody died in police custody, they would call an independent attorney, which was me and this other prosecutor out from Lincoln. Now, under Don Klein, and I believe when Brenda Council was in office, and I'm not blaming Brenda, she's not Ernie, but what happened is they changed section B of that to from an independent attorney outside the prosecutor's office to the prosecutor's office. So in that respect, although I have thousands of issues, the issue that you're concerned about is police brutality. And that was the only statute like that in the nation at one point. And when Ernie left the legislature, they slipped that in, that they changed it from an independent attorney and two prosecutors, and anybody who's a defense attorney can serve as a prosecutor. And that's what was happening. I was a defense attorney, we were prosecutors. We had the unlimited resources of the police department at our disposal. And what happens now is they keep it in-house. Those prosecutors are friends with the police. They worked with them, and they're not going to go really hard on them. And the other issue you have is, you remember the Arbery case where that prosecutor was charged because she did not do her duty in terms of charging the initial prosecutor out of Glenn County or wherever that is. Were you familiar with those particular facts? Where the first prosecutor was charged because she did not go forward and she did not bring any charges in the Arbery case. Prosecutors basically—
Tim, hold it, Tim. You asked him a question there.
Yeah.
Adam, are you familiar with that case or anything?
I'm familiar with the case, but not that particular aspect of it. And frankly, I mean, Tim, one of the things, I can't get too deep sometimes, right?
Right.
I mean, 550 articles, I got to be superficial at some point, but I love the depth of what you're bringing up.
Yeah, but look at the 29, the 29-1401, look at that, and you can ask the reviser for, they'll send you a free copy of what it was when George Bibbins died. And you'll see the two of them starkly. One's for the prosecutor now, and you can add that to your articles. Because when I was there, they appointed me and this other guy. Now they don't appoint outside counsel. So that should be included. And that's a very important part. Not only is it important, but we should be yelling about that. And the two senators down there should be going back and trying to bring Ernie's bill back. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Hey, Timmy, and maybe Adam, it's a question that came up a little bit earlier. How would somebody from the lay public find out what happens in the court document? In other words, you can go to archives and you get stuff like that. Is the same availability for law reviews and articles and cases in court? Is that available to the public? Can the lay public access that information as you can as an attorney?
Yeah, so go down to the clerk's office. They have that little machine down there when you going on the third floor. And if you get the case number or the name, and they're very helpful over there. They will.
Timmy, what I really ask is, can you do it from your house? In other words, can you go on the internet and get the very same information?
That I don't know, because I only go through the attorney portal. Okay.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So I wouldn't know what people who don't have my capabilities and my access would have.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I was just because I think a lot of the stuff that goes on in the courtroom, when we used to have court watch people, they would know that. But again, you got all these little side deals going on and cronyism, and again, it's like Falkenberg got probation when some people think he should have spent at least 6 months in the jail. But again, that's how the justice operates in the United States. Switching back a little bit, if I can. I saw was there another hand or comment came up there? Oh yeah, there's one here. Adam says, do you have contact with anyone from the Omaha Abolitionist Research? I know they have some helpful information, but I'm not sure how far back it goes with the newest organization, but there's a vein of coordination and communication. Do you know anything about them?
I have seen their website, and Katie, I wasn't in love with what I saw. I mean, there was a little bit that kind of cribbed off of some of the things that I did. So I'm
Oh, wait,
a little bit
hold on. You
sensitive
say
about that.
cribbed off the, what do you mean when you just say that? I lost you when you said they cribbed off. Does that mean they hijacked something you did?
I don't want to say plagiarized, but they
Okay.
heavily borrowed.
Okay,
right?
got you. Okay,
And people do that all the time. People do that all the time. They'll take my articles and they'll rewrite them in their own words. I can show you 24 examples of it, and this was one of them. But that said, it's a young organization, and they'll grow into their shoes. And I support any time that white people regard themselves as being abolitionists, so long as they're doing something about that. You can't just be an abolition in word only. You got to do it in deed. So if these guys step up and really do that research and disseminate that and share that big, I'm all about it. Great. And I would love to coordinate and collaborate with them. So Katie, if you have any connection, please help me out.
Other
Quick
feedback.
thing on
Go ahead.
the grand juries. Now, the new grand juries, and of course, this only applies to in-custody deaths, but the new grand juries going forward, if they return a no true bill, meaning they don't indict the officer involved or any of the officers involved, then once that no true bill is finalized, all of the evidence and documents and anything that the grand jury used to consider a case becomes a public record. And that's a huge change in jury laws. So there's going to be a little bit more transparency on how those decisions are made and what information is given to the grand juries. So I anticipate that will, going forward, will at least get more information out there.
Good. Oh, cool. Switch question. I noticed you focus, Adam, on police department, Omaha Police Department in particular. Was there anything that came from your research or data on like the state patrol or the county sheriff office, anything of those individuals who are involved in some of those hideous or those murders of African Americans or people in our community from those other departments?
I actually spent so much time focusing on the OPD that I didn't really get into state patrol or the county sheriff. And that said, obviously that needs to be done. So that's a point of elaboration that I can go on with this article. But I really wanted to shine that light specifically on the OPD, if only because of their direct responsibility for all of these incidences. We can broaden that light and make it bigger and bring more folks in. So yeah, that's something I'll definitely be getting into.
There was a
question.
Go ahead, Tim.
I got a question. Did you find a stark difference in your research between Omaha? Because I've said for years, we have some of the most racist, corrupt judges, prosecutors, and as well as police officers. That doesn't mean all of them are that way, but we have some of those. Did you do a comparison of where Omaha ranks in terms of racism, the corruption, and the basically the sentencing of Blacks in Nebraska as compared to some other states?
Tim, that needs a smarter person than me. I mean, frankly, again, that level of analysis is beautiful. And to contextualize it in the larger picture of Omaha and Omaha's treatments towards African Americans historically, not just in law, but also in all of these various ways, that needs to have that deep questioning that you're asking about. And I don't have that ability, but I would love to see it. So when you get that draft done up, just send it over, man. I'll be glad to read it over for you. It would beautify my heart, and I would share it as widely as I could. But that's the kind of thing that needs to be done for sure, not by me.
You know, one quick point that comes to mind is you would think the criminal justice department, which they're sit on their hands mentality, would be the vanguard in some of this progressive stuff that goes on with the police department and so on. But I know that they tend to hire their former chiefs to be adjunct professors. And I do know a few years ago, one of the guys who worked at Boys Town got caught doing the College World Series, either soliciting prostitution or something. I don't know what came of the case, but I found out later he turned up in the criminal justice department teaching as an adjunct. And I'm saying, you can't even hire Black people in the criminal justice department to teach, at least those who got some rationale, some ethical standards. And then you bring this one guy, I'm not going to mention his race, but who do speak two different languages. And I said, well, hold it. You got to be careful when you bring people into those classes. Again, I do believe in redemption and people can be forgiven and so on. But again, you got to be careful when you bring some people in who have a sad history or some shaky past or unethical behaviors if they're really going to reform themselves. And again, we don't oftentimes give ex-felons or people who are returning citizens those same breaks in many of these academic or these settings in our community. So we got to be very forceful on that. We got about 5 minutes left or so, and I wanted to maybe, if there one last question, then I'm going to give Adam a chance to kind of give some closing comments and maybe some more information on how the people can catch up with him. Any other questions, anything else? I think there is one here. Vaughn from Facebook asks, Adam, are you familiar with the case of Ernest Jackson, and how is that Ernest Jackson is still in prison for a crime that someone has admitted to? Are you familiar with that case?
I've only recently become familiar with it. And Vaughn, I would love to connect with you more about what you know, but I need to research it and learn more about it.
I've heard people talk about another case where there's a Native American guy got shot in the back of the head or something, the neck, and the bullets lodge in there. And instead of the guy getting redressed, they doubled down and gave him extra time in prison when, again, I don't know all the particulars, but I heard that he's unjustly got an inordinate sentence for something when he was fleeing away. And then secondly, for years, the police had a policy that when a person is fleeing away, they wouldn't shoot them in the back or in the head or whatever. And apparently they looked the other way in his particular case. But again, it means somebody has to do their homework. And I do know the Innocence Project has found a number of people been on death row, not only in our state, but elsewhere, and some of them were wrongly convicted. And so, again, those are the issues we got to continue to break forward. We got about, I'd say about 5 minutes left. And I wanted to ask Adam, do you have any closing comments? And also we want people to fill out the evaluation. Either we'll send it to you afterwards or we may be put it in the chat. But Adam, any comments or any things that you would like to share with our listening or participants today that can help us move this conversation forward?
Thanks, Jamal. So I think it's important to say that when folks hear this conversation and when people are really trying to digest what's being said, I come at this with a lens that looks at Omaha's Black history back to 1804. I mean, I'm talking about more than 200 years of history now that have continued to evolve, devolve, regress, progress, and change over and over and over. I'm standing here today in the shadow of Ernie Chambers, in the shadow of Matthew Stelly, Jamal in your shadow. It's so many people who have already addressed this and worked on it. But I want to go all the way back and talk about 1871. 1871, when a man named Edwin Overall became the very first African-American to protest at the Omaha City Council against the Omaha Colored School, started by the City Council 1871 to keep African-American students segregated from Omaha and its white population. That activism going all the way back to then needs to guide us today. That's where we all stand, because Edwin Overall wasn't playing around. He stood on city council, he made his statement, and he did the things to make it happen. So we got to take a cue from Edwin Overall and take that action. We got to take a cue and look at this long range reality that Omaha was built by white people to benefit white people. Now, we know the reality. The reality is African Americans built Omaha. The reality is Native Americans had their land stolen for Omaha. The reality is poor people work to build the city. The reality is wealthy people have always benefited and profiteered off the shoulders of low income people, of poor people, of working class, of immigrants, of Black people, of Native American people, of so many people. But what I have done and what I want everybody here to do is consider not just that big paintbrush, but the actual reality of what's happened, of what's going on. That's why I do the work that I do, Jamal. That's why I have NorthOmahaHistory.com. That's why I have hashtag Omaha Black History, to paint that larger picture, but not with a big brush, but with very specific, very pinned down, very obvious little brush. And what the little brush shows us is that police brutality and police murders of African Americans, not only disproportionate, but long range and deeply impacting. But they work hand in hand with the school to prison pipeline. They work hand in hand with the food deserts throughout North Omaha. They work hand in hand with lead poisoning that's been going on throughout the community for more than a century. They work hand in hand with all of these different factors, whether we're talking about the redlining that still exists in Omaha, whether we're talking about the water quality, whether we're talking, whatever we're talking about, there's so much of it. We need to find out what it is. We need to draw it out. We need to teach young people about it. I hope that there's young people on this conversation right now. I haven't seen them yet, but if you're in high school, love to you, please keep coming. If you're not in high school, if you are older than high school, guys, we got to bring in the young people. We need the young women and the young men to stand in the front of this conversation and to guide us. Because frankly, I'm getting older. I don't know about you, Jamal, but I'm getting older and I'm not going to be around forever. And I got to hand off the baton. And I need young people that I can believe in to hand it to. And that's what we need to do. We need to bring them into these conversations at every opportunity. And I don't just say that as a preacher and evangelist for young people, but I say that from this historical perspective too. We know that it's young people who fought in the 1960s to open up Peony Park to disallow segregation from happening there. We know that it was young people with the DePorres Club who fought segregation in Omaha hiring and Omaha housing and in so many different ways throughout the city. We know that it was young people going all the way back to the 1910s when they were involved in stopping the segregation that was happening on streetcars. So we know that it's young people who, in Omaha who have had so much impact and effect so far, but we need them to keep going and step forward and step strong. And we need to step with them as being their elders, as being their ancestors, as being the past that we can bring into the future and hopefully continue to inform it. So Jamal, that's my piece, man. And the fact of the matter is, this is all for you all. I do it for myself. It feels good. I'm still a white guy with some kind of savior complex, but at the end of the day, I do it for the world and with the hope that Omaha can be more than it is today. So thank you for having me, Jamal. That's it.
Well, Adam Fletcher Sasse, appreciate you doing this again. It's been wonderful. And again, it's one of those, we say diamonds in the rough, and I like to say the Billy Preston line that says nothing from nothing leaves nothing. So if we want to be about something, as he would say, you got to be, if you're going to hang, we got to be about something. Basically, we have to do something. And so we can talk about it. We can read a book here and there, but we got to, again, change the narrative of what many people experience. And there are traumatized people in our city who have not been able to heal or get reconciliation because we haven't had these conversations. We do believe in freedom of speech, but we also believe in freedom of thought. So that's why this is so important. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light here with Adam Fletcher Sasse. And again, we hope to maybe have you come back and talk about some other stuff you're working on related to North Omaha or African Americans or anti-racism or whatever. So thank you very much for tuning in. We'd like for folks to fill out the evaluation. If you have any suggestions or future programs or things that you'd like for us to cover or facilitate, feel free to contact us, and our information is on the webpage. Adam has made his information available if you want to talk to him more after this event. So we hope you've had a good time tonight. As we always end, may the force be with you, and Baroko.